Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session on critical raw materials. Once upon a time, not in the long distance, mining, metals, minerals industry used to be considered as the ugly duckling in the room. And critical raw materials put that same industry in the center of global economic policy, energy transition, national security, industrial strategy, as well as resource diplomacy. So today we have two distinguished keynote speakers and a group of expert panels that you see here. I don't want to waste any more time, and I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker, President and Chairman of Export-Import Bank of United States. Please welcome John Jovanovic. And DFC, US Exim is one of the very active lending agencies in the critical raw material landscape. John.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And you've got a terrific panel, so I promise I won't spend too much time and keep you from hearing their wisdom. So from our perspective, this is my first time in Uzbekistan, but I'm very proud to say that today at the Tashkent Investment Forum, we brought the largest ever delegation of US companies to participate. And it's actually the largest delegation of US businesses to ever be in Uzbekistan for any one event. And we're very proud to say that a good number of the companies and a good amount of our focus is actually on supply chain security. So we wouldn't be here today leading this delegation were it not for the vision of President Mirozev, his incredible engagement with President Trump, and his firm desire to deepen his commercial ties, but also strategic ties with the United States. Now, back in November in Washington, we signed a Buy American, Build the Future framework, where at Exim, we are engaging with our Uzbek partners. They've decided and have made the wise decision, we believe, to select US companies, technology providers, capital and financial institutions as a preferred partner for some of their key areas of modernization, whether it be critical industries, aviation, water and irrigation, agriculture, tourism, but most importantly, supply chain security. And so I've just been on a whirlwind tour. I know we have our friend from OECD here. So I started off my last tour. I was at home for a day to pick up my 12-year-old daughter who's joined me here on this visit, which is fantastic. She's off doing something fun while we're working here. We actually started off at the OECD ministerial meeting in Paris, where I was the US representative talking about modernization efforts with Minister Šefčovič from the European Commission and many others. And it actually ended back in Paris 2 weeks later, where I was a representative at the G7 meeting on critical minerals, leading into the meetings that have just happened at Evian. And no matter where we travel, no matter which room we're in, there are so many things upon which we disagree. And we could focus on that, but we think it'll be to very little value. The area where there is broad-based agreement is on the need to focus on supply chain security, to do it by way of broader puzzle pieces that come together, because it is one of those very key areas where doing it alone won't help. We become over-reliant on supply chains we all believe that aren't free, they aren't fair, they aren't functioning, and they aren't resilient to what we need them to be. And going back to no matter what you may think about which direction we need to head economically by way of various technologies, the one thing we can all agree on is that critical raw materials and supply chain security is foundational to it all. And so what I hope we'll have more conversation on, whether it's having to do with some issues around transparency, whether it's how do we get more capital to flow into the space, whether it's talking about how things like OECD modernization, how multinational, how policy lenders could play a role, or quite frankly, how do we expand the companies, the technology providers that are involved. One thing we hope will do is crowd in more participants, crowd in more at-risk capital, and do everything we can to fortify these supply chains. Because, again, regardless of your philosophical leaning, political views on where we're going, one thing that is absolutely true is that critical raw materials will form the basis. Now, here in Uzbekistan, so many things going for you. You have a couple of things that are perfectly aligned. First and foremost, you have a vision for what you want to be over the next decades to come. You have a young population, 60% of whom are under the age of 35. You have a growing economy. You're opening up, you continue to open up to the world. You're also blessed with natural resources. And this is where I think our strategic partnership can really blossom, because this is an area of mutual benefit where we can bring supply chain security to US companies operating not just in the US, but all around the globe. And by the way, foreign companies operating in the US, that what at the Export-Import Bank we do a ton of, right? All in support of jobs across America. But also what we want to do, and this is where we think there's tremendous opportunity here, is to help catalyze value-added industries. Industries that go above and beyond simple extraction. And so that's where we hope that our partnership will continue to grow. I wish you great discussion here. You've got tremendous lineup here. And so we very much hope that you enjoy the rest of the summit and that we all see you at some point soon. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Now, I've agreed to be tortured by a few questions, so I'll answer them and then we'll move on.
Okay. Well, thank you, John. Well, what comes to my mind is in Uzbekistan, the division of the president, the centralized and the dedicated focus on critical raw materials, and the unique pragmatism that U.S. has brought into the critical raw material landscape. So it is not surprising those two nations attracted each other in the critical raw material landscape. The partnership appears to be in the works. What do you think are the next top 3 or 5 action items that both countries needs to focus on to take this from intent to execution?
Well, I'm very glad to hear that you weren't surprised, right? But for many people, the U.S. having the largest business delegation here at the Tashkent Investment Forum wasn't necessarily on their bingo card. If you want to hit your red button, perfect. It wasn't necessarily on their bingo card, right? This is for some, quite a big surprise. And I have to say, President Trump's approach to Central Asia is quite unique and quite novel for U.S. foreign policy, right? So for the longest time, and I'm a repeat offender, as you know, right? I served the president in his first administration. And even back then, when we talked about Central Asia, we talked about it in some other context, right? We were talking about Southeast Asia. We were talking about issues with regards to your neighbors to the north. We were talking about other, as we would say, equities, right? From Washington or at the State Department. And what President Trump changed about that, he said, look, Central Asia is too important. These countries have too much to offer the global stage. And from a U.S. perspective, there's a real opportunity to strengthen and fortify bilateral economic and political relations to our mutual benefit. And so he's massively elevated this relationship, right? I think President Mirozev has met with President Trump 2 or 3 times, right? In the past year. I think they've spoken 4 times, right? We've hosted him and spent time with him in Washington twice, right? This is a level, and by the way, I tell everybody I can that the Uzbeks are great partners, right? Because they do what they say and they say what they do, right? And that amount of engagement really matters. And so coming back to your question, I think what's most critical is that our early engagement show tangible benefit on both sides, right? So we have in the works from Exim's perspective, a couple of key loans, which we anticipate will be effectuated here shortly. We continue to add to the list. We think doing so in a way that brings about further industrial and economic growth here while helping support job creation in America is important. And also yesterday, as you know, we announced a joint investment framework with Development Finance Corporation with our counterparts. Ben Black, who's fantastic, he's here as well. And what we hope to do is have that be another area of capital flow, because For those at the plenary session or who watched it today, this is incredibly well-produced video. The one thing missing was next year we want to see more American companies and more American investors up there. I think that'll be a success.
All right, thank you very much. John, I know you're short in time. Do you want to take a question from the audience or do you have to go?
I could take one more and then I've got to go.
Any
Yeah.
questions from the audience? It looks like you have to go, John.
That's all right. Well, thank you all very much. Enjoy, have a fantastic panel and good discussion.
Well, I'm certainly going to change this format because if I sit over there, I'm going to have a neck pain by the end of the day. So I'd like to introduce our second keynote speaker, the first Deputy Minister of Mining Industry, Geology in Republic of Uzbekistan, Firuza Kamidova. She is one of the key leaders of Uzbekistan's journey in critical raw materials with abundance of experience in financing. So, First Deputy Minister.
Assalamu alaikum.
Good afternoon, welcome.
Dear guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to see you here at one of the most important events of 2026, our 5th Tashkent International Investment Forum, which brings together business, governmental structures, international organizations, and also expert community. As you all know, the critical minerals, the sustainability of the supply chain became one of the key topics of the global economy and policy in general. The government of Uzbekistan views the critical minerals not only as a national resource, but also as the foundation for the sustainable supply chains operating in Uzbekistan and global markets as well. Our country is a country rich in critical minerals, and the government set a task for the sustainable development of the sector as a main part of our agenda. So the reforms are being carried out. Introduction of the new law on the subsoil, guided by the global standards. The new law introduces the key principles and the guidelines, the licensing, resource management, minimizing uncertainty for the investors, and also stimulating, galvanizing the investment through the tax reforms, and also revisiting the results of the previous surveys, strengthening the regulators' activities. At the initiative of the head of the state in 2024, the Uzbek complex for the technology metals was established, and we covered the resources, also shaped the supply chains. As of today, this complex actually exports the metals in line with international standards to the US, Japan, South Korea, and other countries. Together with that, the geological study of the territory of the country is only 40%, but the cost of the mineral resources amounts to more than 3 billion USD, which shows a big capacity for the further development. The Uzbekistan 2030 development strategy defines the transition from the export of mineral resources as the raw materials to the export with a high value added, which will improve the infrastructure of the remote areas, create new jobs, and also improve the well-being of the population. Based on these tasks, in Samarkand region, the work started on forming the specialized cluster. Within this project, in the next 4 years, we will create step by step new capacity to process up to 4,000 tons of the processing of the materials. And maybe this is not a very realistic goal, but I could say that 8 years ago that we imported actually the wolframite concentrate, the tungsten concentrate, but in 2026 we are planning to have about 500 tons. So the complex was established 2 years ago, but now they are producing 500 tons. This is not a fantasy, this is something real. Also in Tashkent region, the molybdenum cluster will be created. We will ensure the processing of the raw up to 2.5 tons per year. There we will have the entire supply chain, the raw materials, processing, ready-made technologies, which will improve the value added of the product 2 or 3 times. Currently, we have about 100 investment projects amounting to 2 billion USD, which are directed at 25 types of the critical minerals. Our strategic task is to become not only a reliable supplier of the raw materials, but also a regional center for the processing, enrichment, and the production of the products with a high value added, integrated into the global supply chain in terms of the critical materials. Dear participants, we would like to invite our partners, international investors, to actively participate in the implementation of the projects on the critical minerals. We are open to investment, to the joint developments, partnerships, implementation of the projects on mutually beneficial conditions. We guarantee the support, the transparent terms for the business, and also long-term partnership. We strongly believe that Uzbekistan is consistently moving towards this pathway and becomes a reliable partner in terms of the new global, sustainable, and secure supply chains. We have all the necessary competence, and the investment opportunities will serve as the new growth points and will ensure long-term economic effect for all of the participants. I would like to wish all of the participants best of luck, fruitful work, internal discussions, and successful networking. Thank you.
Deputy Minister, thank you very much for those comments. My question to you is, you have extensive experience in project finance, and the total amount of investment that is needed in the critical raw materials in Uzbekistan, the number varies from 2.5 to $4 billion. How do you see that being financed? And also, it is important to recognize that there's $220 million that has been allocated from Uzbekistan Reconstruction and Development Fund, which is a very strong anchor as well as a strong commitment from the government. But how do you see the path to project finance of all these different critical raw material projects?
Thank you. You asked indeed interesting question. I will answer it, of course. Yes, correctly. The government invested 220 million US dollars. It was a right step. And the government gave a message that on an early stage, our government demonstrated commitment to share the risks on development stage and also created favorable conditions for implementation of those projects and for sustainability of the enterprise. But this money are not enough. We have quite ambitious goals. A lot of projects are there, a lot of interesting projects to come. And as a financial specialist, I want to say that there is a problem. Cheap, long-lasting loans and insurance, but they have some rules, audit, some financial responsibility, proper engineering, ratings, terms of reference from the bank. Our enterprise is just 2 years old. It's clear that we cannot fulfill all requirements, but despite of this, we can still use other tools such as financing for offtake contracts. That's why we work in this direction. In order to have long-term contracts for financing. If the enterprise has this long-term contract, it's a good advantage. It means they can generate good revenues, and for credit organization, it means low risks, right? Number two, yes, indeed, we are just 2 years old, but a few months ago, we had a competition on attracting corporate investment that does not have this long list of requirements. It was a very successful competition. So 5 banks provided their offers. It's not long money, it's corporate financing. It's a direct loan without involving local banks, and I believe that as a part of the forum, we'll sign the this loan agreement. They have lowest interest rate and the better conditions. So I boldly believe that financial organizations and banks should not be afraid of our enterprise. Yes, it is relatively new and fresh, does not have huge volumes of production, but it is highly supported by the government. And with the example of Wolfram, I told you how we increased our volumes as much as 10 times. Our enterprise has good perspectives, and I believe that we'll get project financing next year.
Before we start, can you turn that off, please? Before we start the panel discussion, I wanted to share some thoughts with you. I had the privilege of spending almost a year and a half in Tashkent, working closely with Uzbekistan's Technological Metals Complex, which is the dedicated state-owned enterprise for the development and operations of critical raw materials. That experience has given me a close view of the scale of opportunities as well as the challenges in the critical raw material landscape, both on the demand as well as on the supply side. Uzbekistan is approaching the critical raw material platform in a manner to improve its industrialization, high value added production, high value enhancement, and a meaningful contribution to the GDP. This objective is achieved through TMK's fully integrated operations in the upstream, midstream, and downstream manufacturing with a project portfolio. This distinction is quite unique in the global critical raw material landscape. There are several realities in the critical raw materials that are fully understood, so I don't think there is any need to talk about those. Critical raw materials are important. The urgency of access diversification by the demand side of advanced economies is urgent. The urgency for technological development or improvement, particularly in the midstream and downstream, is real. China's dominant position in the critical raw materials fully recognized, but what I would also propose to you is that China should also be viewed as a commercial competitor with a unique value proposition in mineral-rich jurisdictions. in a competitive environment, as we all know, understanding competitors' weaknesses, strengths, and value proposition is essential to be an active player in that environment. But let me make a simple point. The world does not have shortage of intent for partnership, as we have seen in this forum today, yesterday, and today. That intent is already visible by government-to-government MOUs, and in fact, many more MOUs at the business level and at the execution level. But we also know MOUs do not provide finance, MOUs do not build mines, and MOUs do not provide responsible supply. The next phase, and I believe that next phase to be now, we should therefore move from a focused establishment of well-defined partnerships and execution with partners. We should move from expressions of interest to well-defined joint commitments, well-defined accountabilities, responsibilities, milestones, equally well-developed roadmaps for execution, for project development, for finance, for construction, and ultimately responsible operations. This, in my view, is the key theme of our discussion today. What should be done differently to turn the geologic potential into responsible execution? For me, and I'd like you, the panel members, to add to this, for me, the areas that require particular focus are partnership. It's a term that is used liberally in the critical raw material landscape. But what does it mean? What are the principles? What are the pillars of an effective and a long-term partnership that serves both the objectives of the demand side and the supply side? International standards and execution capacity. International standards is the language of international business conduct. There is a saying, and it was repeated in the video today, foreign capital follows trust. International standards are the mechanisms that provide trust for the projects. International standards cannot be diluted for domestic circumstances. It also requires a team building. At the end of the day, in all of these projects, it is a concept on paper. And that concept becomes a reality through people. Financiers, investors, partners, their confidence is going to increase if they see the human resource capacity and capability that exists to execute these projects. Supply chain pathway and the role of OEMs. Do we, particularly OEMs, fully understand the structure of the supply chain pathways and all of the shareholders, stakeholders that are included in that pathway? Are the OEMs across many manufacturing industries adequately involved in the critical raw material dialogue? Ultimately, it is the OEMs that are exposed to supply chain disruptions. My last comment will be the term great project. The definition of a great project varies among stakeholders. A definition of a great project for a project proponent is different than a lender, an investor, off-taker, communities, governments, and policymakers. It is only when the value for each one of those stakeholders is recognized and addressed in a project that it becomes great project. To make a project great, it is very important to look at those projects from the lenses of each one of those stakeholders. So with that, I have a simple request from my panel members. Let us be specific with the challenges in moving to actionable items. Let us offer solutions to these challenges, and let's have an open, productive, action-oriented discussion. So with that, I would like to invite first Mark Robinson, Executive Director of Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. This initiative is quite important in jurisdictions in developing economies to present a positive differentiator. So I look forward to Mark's comments.
Thank you so much, Han. Pleasure to be here again in Uzbekistan. Deputy Minister, good to see you on our panel. The EITI, which I head, is a global multi-stakeholder initiative dedicated to driving up standards of governance and transparency in oil, gas, and mining. I was really pleased to hear John and then the Deputy Minister both refer to the importance of transparency in their opening remarks, because that's what our organization is dedicated to. I'm going to use a few slides, which I think will help, because I know we have a lot of non-English speakers in the audience, and start with a few propositions to share with you. We've heard a lot about the transformational potential in resource-rich countries, including Uzbekistan, huge investor interest and huge potential for increased investment in the future. But there's huge potential deficits to be addressed around the sources of critical raw materials, especially in copper and lithium. Central Asia is well poised to take advantage of this potential, with enormous growth prospects for several countries in the region, including Uzbekistan, as you will know, especially in copper and lithium. At the same time, we're seeing an urgency to secure access to those critical raw materials from many governments and many companies around the world. They hold out the prospect of growth and jobs in securing the access to those raw materials to meet the industrial and security needs of consumer countries. The EITI comes in by seeking to provide confidence to investors, to foreign direct investors in the sector about which we've heard so much. We know that investors want a number of things when they invest significant amounts of capital. They want to know, is there long-term political stability? They want to know whether the government is going to be committed over the longer term. And they want to know that their investments will be safe and sound, supported by a strong legal and institutional framework, i.e. good governance in the sector. And we now have a cumulative amount of evidence to point to the linkages between countries that have signed up and are committed to standards like ours, and showing a positive effect on net foreign investment flows. And of course, it's also a critical source of revenue for resource-rich countries seeking to invest, as we see in Uzbekistan, hugely in infrastructure and in public services. This can be a hugely important income stream. So at the end of the day, EITI is there to support countries like Uzbekistan, members like Tajikistan, Kyrgyz Republic, and Kazakhstan, who have all been members for the last 10 years, to put transparency at the heart of policymaking in the natural resources sector. And as we see more MOUs that Hans spoke about, more resource deals being negotiated, transparency has to be at the heart of those, aligned strongly with national priorities. So we see transparency as a safeguard to protect governments and their citizens against the risk of unfair deals, but also a signal of credibility with potential investors in the sector. So we already have 3 members alongside Mongolia who've been implementing the EITI standard for over 10 years. I'm here because I'm discussing with the government of Uzbekistan about the potential benefits of membership of the EITI. Conversations along those lines are ongoing. And there are many reasons why now would be a good time for that. It certainly would enhance the confidence of investors in the sector to see Uzbekistan on its reform path, signing up to these principles at the heart of its policy agenda. We know the country has huge resource potential. I've had the pleasure of visiting Al Malik and seen the enormous expansion taking place in that state mining company. And we know that Uzbekistan is poised to make a major contribution to enhancing global supply chains in minerals. So this is a timely opportunity for the country to consider, as it expands the sector, to also demonstrate to adherence to standards like that of the EITI, to put governance and transparency at the heart of policymaking, both to reassure investors, to produce a secure stream of revenue in the sector, and to mitigate governance risks, which we know from experience all over the world are always associated with this sector, and that adherence to such standards at the EITI can do a lot to mitigate such risks going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So we're going to go to our next speaker, and we'll hopefully have some time at the very end for a Q&A session. So our next speaker is Andrei Novitsky, Managing Director and Partner of Boston Consultancy Group in Tashkent. Andrei?
Yeah, thank you very much, Han. Well, I got the message. I'll try to be short and concise, and hopefully, like my whole career was taught to be like very precise. I think Uzbekistan now is in a very interesting and unique situation. From one side, all of us, and like me included, we are super positive about the geological endowment of the country, its richness, as well in the critical minerals like resources. We all feel and know, like, yeah, if you can go to the, yeah. We all know that there is like a abundance of the critical mineral resources, like in the country. And it's very important. That's what keeps us, like enthusiastic about the food potential. And as you said, like we see also a lot of interest from, like their foreign partners, from the financial institutions, from industrial companies. They all want to come and work in Uzbekistan, and they're very happy to sign, multiple MOUs, like non-binding term sheets. But on the other side, somehow, like the ball is not rolling at the required speed. We see limited, like real investment deployed. We see a lot of discussions, but like very, well, if I may say, slow pace of actually the development of the project. And we were asking ourselves, like, what is the issue? Like, what prevents the country from making that leapfrog from the country with the resources to the country with the production of critical minerals? And we believe that, like there are a few elements to that puzzle which still need to be addressed to improve the quality of the process. And number one for us is, like as I think Johan mentioned that, is ability to speak the same language between all the participants and the stakeholders of this game. And that language is international standards. We feel and we see that there is still some headroom for improvement in terms of the application of international standards to Uzbekistan and its resource base. We see a lot of investors approaching, actually even the BCG, asking like for the guidance, what's the best asset to invest. Most of them, they want, of course, the operating assets, which is limited. Like, well, there are like 6 large companies. Like there's Al Malik, there's Navoy, there's TMK, a few more, but they are all like well properly run. Like they're not up for sale at the moment. And they say, okay, where do we go? Then they want to see the upcoming projects. But when they speak about the upcoming projects, they all want to see the internationally verified mineral resource estimate. They want to see at least like a concept study or pre-feasibility study. There's a very specific, like a list of documents which are required by investors to make the move. And we see that often, there's a lot of enthusiasm, like at the level of the project companies in Uzbekistan in reaching out to investors. in saying that we have the resources, but there is still like some reluctance to prepare and invest into the preparation of the projects for their to be fully financed and funded by the foreign partners. And Firuz Rustamna mentioned that, you know, like there's, of course, first steps are being made, and there's like a lot of interest from the banks to finance the projects. I believe there could be many more of those agreements if some of the projects went the typical standard way as they're developed in foreign countries. The exploration, concept study, pre-feasibility. Once all these documents and steps are properly addressed, we'll see much many more deals, you know, like more capital deployed, and as well eventually more of the critical minerals produced. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. Our next speaker is Sarah Whitten, Chief Commercial Officer of U.S. Export-Import Bank. Sarah?
Thank you so much. And I'm without slides, but basically, I think, we heard from our chairman early on, and what I would really like to highlight is how important this topic has become within the U.S. government environment, and then with amongst other export credit agencies globally. Uzbekistan has been really central to our focus for many reasons. The first is we've got new leadership coming in as of late last year. Our chairman joined EXIM in September of last year. And as he mentioned, in November, we signed the Buy America, Build the Future framework with Uzbekistan. And why did we choose Uzbekistan as the first market in which we did that? Well, it was because the partnership was so strong, and the partners on the government side made it easy for us to engage, in the sense that there was a lot of discussion already, a lot of development of relationships with American suppliers and American providers of goods and services, where there was a list of transactions that we could look to focus on. And so going back to this point of, we don't want to sign MOUs for the sake of signing MOUs, that's been my philosophy since day one, and our chairman and our leadership's philosophy as well. We don't want to sign things like that unless it's going to mean something. And so the nice thing about what we've entered into is within 3 months, we actually signed and dispersed our first deal. It was a relatively $25 million transaction in another sector, not critical minerals, but under that partnership agreement with Uzbekistan. 5 sectors were mentioned in that agreement that we have. The first was critical minerals. And so this in many ways feels like a full circle moment for me sitting in this panel in Tashkent at the Investment Forum talking about this topic. Shortly thereafter in Washington, the US had hosted the C5+1 conference where, again, dignitaries from Uzbekistan were present, and we progressed the bilateral engagements even further. In February of this year, Secretary Rubio hosted the Critical Minerals Ministerial in Washington, D.C. EXIM, 2 days prior to that, on our 92nd anniversary, we've been a federal agency that's been around for 92 years. We announced Project Vault, which is the strategic commercial reserve of critical minerals in the United States that would be used for non-defense purposes. And so internally, as an agency, we've been doing a lot in this sector. And the reason it's been such an important sector for us is, of course, our mandate as an export credit agency is to create jobs in the United States. And so we're not looking for a return on our investment. We're a senior debt provider, so obviously we do need to get paid back. And this is the first year that we are fully repaying U.S. Treasury in terms of the exposures. So, we're really putting some accountability in regards to our exposures and our portfolio, which is fantastic. But at the end of the day, what we get measured on is, are we creating jobs in the States? And why this is so important is because of some of these supply chain dependencies, our manufacturing base in the US has not had access at certain times to key critical minerals. And for that reason, the capital that we deploy, we want to ensure that we're influencing the flow of the supply chains towards US manufacturers. And so this was really exciting for us, where typically, in the 92 years that we've been present, we had focused our tools towards the export of US goods and services into international infrastructure transactions. I led the development of a program called the Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative, where we were essentially turning our mandate on its head to say, look, if there is the import into the United States of critical minerals as feedstock, then we can actually support those international projects on the upstream. And so once we launched that new policy, our pipeline grew exponentially. And so we now have the problem that you were referring to, which is, ensuring that the projects that we progress are well suited to progress, and that the project developers have put in the necessary time and capital investment, have conducted the feasibility studies and the bankability studies, have technical know-how and partners that can withstand volatility in markets. And this is really why, as EXIM, our capital is required. Minerals and critical minerals in particular has been severely underinvested for the last 2 decades. I mean, if you're a US investor and you can choose to invest in tech or mining, I mean, the upside potential is immense in tech, for example, right? And so there was a flight of capital for the last couple of decades away from critical minerals. And so as the US government, again, given we're not looking for immense upside potential from a returns perspective, we started to really focus on this sector. And what's been very interesting is where in the past we saw the financing, the private sector financiers coming to the party being very niche investors. Now that scope has broadened. And so in many ways, our role is to ensure that our capital is unlocking private sector capital. And by virtue of our involvement in the sector, we are seeing the bulge bracket financial institutions starting to finance these transactions as well, coming alongside us. And so that has been a very exciting development to see over the past year. So essentially, that's what we're trying to address in engaging in the critical mineral sector. Uzbekistan in particular, as we're talking about mining, is very exciting. I believe it was over $17 billion of production in the last year. There's about an estimate, I believe, of $3 trillion of mineral reserves in the country. So certainly the upside potential is huge, and clearly a massive bridge to financing those projects coming online. Mining also is a very strategic asset in many countries, and oftentimes it's entities such as ourselves as export credit agencies that can withstand that type of risk, given sort of the engagement of many sovereign state-owned entities and things like that. And also it's a long tenor game, right? I mean, you don't get a mine coming online in 2-3 years. And oftentimes it's not corporate balance sheet lending, it's project finance, it's multi-stakeholder. It takes a long time to develop and to get the right parties in the room. And so we need to come in knowing that we can withstand that risk horizon, which oftentimes that additional tenor that we can provide, it provides a lot of additional comfort to the private sector to come in and provide additional capital. And so bankability, of course, is very important. I believe the deputy minister mentioned offtake agreements. Certainly something that we always look at. The more niche the critical minerals are, the less traded they are, the more liquid they are. And so pricing risk becomes a major concern as well. Again, pointing back to the need for some public sector capital, such as ourselves, to get involved. But again, I would just summarize to say, we've got a massive pipeline. There's been some, due to the listing of the fund here, and some discussion about potential IPOs of the mining assets. There's obviously a big push towards diversification of capital sources. And so we think the timing is absolutely right here, right now, not just for us to get involved, but for the broader investor community to take a serious look at these transactions as they're starting to come online. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Our next speaker is Gregory Lecomte, Head of Central Asia Unit at OECD. Gregory?
First Deputy Minister, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, The OECD has no financing for mining projects. The OECD has a policy framework on standards. In this context, we've been advising governments of Central Asia in the last 2 years on policies for critical minerals. This has emerged as a key topic for our member states, including the US and beyond, and for the region. And today's panel is an indication of this. So I have prepared just one slide, if we can move to this slide. So just highlighting the key messages of my intervention that will aim at responding to one question, how to make investments or partnership happen. And use the word partnership, so let's use this word. Can we move to the next page, please? Следующий slide, пожалуйста. From our recent work in the region, 3 priorities perhaps stand out. One is strengthening information and regulatory clarity. Second is promoting the highest possible standard. And third is supporting risk-sharing instruments. We've heard here and there about this. I will just try to provide the OECD overview, consolidating this information. So let's start with clarity. Across many regions, not only Central Asia, but including Central Asia, one of the most binding constraints is not the absence of resources, it's a lack of reliable geological information and predictability. Our recent OECD work shows that there is a lack of documentation or dissemination of data with outdated surveys sometimes and limited transparency of data. Central Asia is specific in this sense compared to maybe Africa, that there was an institutional framework in Soviet times for mining, so it's not creating new institutions, it's transitioning from old practice and institutions to more internationally recognized institutions. And sometimes transitioning is more difficult than creating them from scratch. So this lack of information, lack of clarity has an impact on investor perceptions of risk, particularly at the exploration stage, but not only. And exploration is already characterized by high uncertainty and no immediate revenue streams. What we heard from investors is that they consistently point to the need for clear, stable, and predictable legal framework. This goes beyond the mining sector in the region. This is a more pervasive question in the region. But coming back to mining sector, for instance, SOEs sometimes combine regulatory and commercial functions, and sometimes licensing, taxation, or environmental rules are not applied consistently, and this has an impact on the cost of capital and delays projects. So in practice, what does that mean? What does OECD recommend, since we like making recommendations? First, enhancing geological mapping, exploration data, and aligning reserve reporting with international standards. This is already the case in some countries of the region, but not in all of them. The objective is to increase transparency, reduce uncertainty, and allow investors to properly assess project feasibility. Second is to sometimes be maybe more clear on the rules applicable to critical minerals, licensing, fiscal regime, and dispute resolution mechanisms. So this is for, let's say, the clarity of rules. Now coming to what we call standards or ESG standards. So the message from the OECD is that high standards are a competitive advantage, not necessarily a constraint. Yes, critical mineral supply chains are under intense scrutiny from downstream industries, the financial actors, and consumers. So investors are increasingly sensitive to ESG risks, and these are recognized, and this has been mentioned by Mark, for instance. These are recognized as major drivers of investment decisions. In Central Asia, again, progress has been made, so it's not like everything is lagging behind. So there is a strong positive dynamic, but what we observe is sometimes uneven enforcement of environmental rules, gaps in occupational health and safety standards, and inconsistencies in consultation practices with the local communities, for instance. So what we suggest, again, back to the recommendations, one is to look at OECD responsible business conduct standards. There was a panel yesterday in which we intervened, in fact, on this topic. So the RBC standards give the overall direction on how companies should behave to respect as much as possible local communities, environment, civil society. We also suggest governments of the region to integrate mining and CRM-specific environmental objectives into their development strategies. This is sometimes included, this is sometimes missing. So again, the message here is high standards do not deter investment. They may attract different type of investor, longer term and more responsible. And Han was mentioning this at the beginning. I will finish with the third dimension or the third pillar, which has been addressed by Sarah. It's risk sharing. When business climate takes time to improve, you need to share risks, to make projects happen in the shorter term. So this is also a message from the OECD, and this is true in particular in capital intensive and high risk projects, such as mining projects. So mining projects are too risky, too capital intensive. So the financing gap is huge in the world for this sector, but also in Central Asia, of course. So we suggest using instruments could be export financing, development financing, what we call risk-sharing instruments to make this project happen in a shorter term. Because on the one hand, you have the demand from member states, OECD, it's urgent to diversify. On the other hand, you have this risk that may deter or delay investment projects. So the use of guarantees, concessional loans, equity, or export finance are examples of tools OECD support the definition of or support improving them. So to conclude, again, three messages: clarity, high standards, risk sharing, and with this together, Han will make partnerships happen maybe faster. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Gregory. Our next speaker, Yarmolai Solzhenitsyn, Senior Partner, Global Metals Leader, McKinsey & Company. Yarmolai.
Okay, let's thank you very much. Yeah, look, I think, you know, as we think about mining space, I mean, generally speaking, beyond even different countries classify critical in different ways. Across the mineral space, we can see a massive deficit for the materials needed for industry, energy transition, the various growth projects that are associated, frankly, with like the billion consumers that are entering the middle class phase of development, you know, over the next decades. I mean, I was at a meeting not long ago. Somebody was saying, look, for the last 50 years, when people hit the middle class, they buy 10 kilograms of copper per year. And that hasn't changed for the last decades. And of course, we have now a new electrification, you have the data centers, but even things like that just mean that as more and more citizens of the planet enter into that consumption level, the demand for many minerals, copper in this case, will be significant. At the same time, again, as everybody knows, the fines are less and less, the grades are declining, the fines are in more difficult places, they're in more difficult jurisdictions, and so this whole puzzle is a big challenge overall for the mining space. And Uzbekistan is no exception, right? So of course, you need to think about exploration. By the way, exploration globally, $15 billion a year total is spent roughly on exploration. You need 30. And it goes across the mineral space. And then once you do the exploration, then of course, as you said, the geology is more complicated. The grades are lower. Then you need the infrastructure. Do we have the water, transport, energy, electricity? Let's assume you solve that. Who's going to work there? There's a lot of other stuff going on. I mean, generation, you know, whichever is the latest letter about the generation, is mining or metals the area where people want to go to? Quite often, there's some other spaces that they want to. So there's that question. And then there's the question which governments all over the world are asking, and societies are asking, what value from what's created is left in my economy? What's my upstream supply chain localization? What's my downstream monetization? How much manufacturing can I do? after these minerals, are produced, can I be doing something for the domestic market, not just be an export country? And this question goes from developed markets to developing, from the north to the south, from the west to the east. It's kind of a new normal. And so at least what we observe is that, again, the questions that are being asked everywhere and in this region is, okay, how do I do this all in a balanced way? How do I do it in a way that's good for the environment, that's good investment, that's good for the economy? How do I share risk, as many have been talking about? How do I attract investors from the outside? How do I create more jobs, including, for example, juniors? I mean, that's a big topic in many geographies and some quite underdeveloped. So I think all of the holistic challenges that globally people talk about also are present here. I think, it's on the one hand, it's an opportunity for Uzbekistan to learn from the path that others have traveled before, because maybe you come to some of these questions later. On the other hand, the world is accelerating and changing so fast that probably there is no previous playbook. But I would say that, the challenges and the answers are probably can be learned a lot from elsewhere. But of course, fundamentally, I think what I hear the government here talking about is it's a very balanced end-to-end value chain approach, and that probably can cover a lot of the minerals. In the interest of time, I think I would only just say that, therefore, cooperation, like internationally and globally, is something obviously that Uzbekistan is on that road, and I imagine that will continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Yermolay. And finally, Adam Wojorski, co-founder of Tasca. Adam?
Hi, good afternoon. Very happy to be on this panel because we're from the private sector. So we are a project developer and an asset manager specifically for critical minerals. And the reason we've come to Uzbekistan is because of the trust the international community is now seeing that they can place in Uzbekistan. They're seeing that Uzbekistan really has the right idea when it comes to, as we've heard today, sharing responsibility and sharing risk in a lot of projects. And I'll spend the next few minutes just talking about very specifically how you can share that risk and what support that a private company like us needs in order to engage with an economy. So if we take the example of tungsten concentrate or even copper, for the last 200 years or so, it's been a very uncomfortable truth for the region that a lot of raw material has been exported to other countries, and the value out of that material has increased by 10, 20, 50 times abroad, and then it's been purchased back into the economy, and then made into an automotive or something like that. So what is very impressive with Uzbekistan, and we've heard a bit about UzTMK, so the Technological Metals Complex, with whom we've just signed a binding agreement with on developing a project in high-performance alloys. What's really interesting is that was formed by presidential decree in order to address the problem of we don't want to see raw material just leaving the country and then the value is leaving the economy. And the price of that material is sold at, let's say $3 per kilo, and then they buy it back in at 20 or 30. So I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but it's important to understand how do you make sure that you can process and increase value add in an economy that historically has been exporting a little bit more upstream. So it's all about the customer for us, obviously. So, revenue makes everything move. But obviously a plant to put it up in Uzbekistan or wherever you're putting it up, you need to prove that you have customers and offtakes involved. So you don't buy a copper wire, you buy an EV. You don't buy a lithium metal, you buy a battery that goes in your EV. And similarly for aviation or whatever it is. And it's clear that UzTMK has been very focused on that end-to-end analysis. And then where we come in is we've found, and we interact very, very closely with American and European off-takers, so customers, to make sure that the transparency and the certification of that product matches what's expected by international markets. So for the case of, say, titanium alloy that needs to go into a jet, it has a very, very specific quality, bandwidth, size, purity, etc., but also where it was produced it needs to be very, very clear for international markets and how it was produced. There was no slave labor, how was the electricity generated, the bill of materials, and these conditions are being becoming more and more strict as the commodity space is no longer the dirty little brother. It's becoming extremely important for the entire world. And even 3-4 years ago, the words critical raw materials weren't the buzzword they are today. Now you have 60 critical raw materials on the US list. You have about 34 on the EU Critical Raw Materials Act. But you need to make sure that if tungsten metal leaves the country, or titanium metal leaves the country, or whatever it ends up being, that it leaves the country in a form that doesn't require additional processing or too much additional processing, and therefore investment before it gets to the end user. And so we fill that gap. So you need offtake, you need cooperation in terms of transparency of who you're working with, if you're making a JV in the country, etc. And the transparency itself is the product. It's not just the metal, but the transparency is the product. So the call to action we were sort of asked to bring to the table today is we need to make sure that we can see sharing of risk on a project level with these state-run organizations that you have in Uzbekistan. And we already see that. We managed to sign a binding agreement within a short amount of time through a very, very large and very, very hard work by our counterparties on the ground here. So we're very inspired and we're very happy to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Han.
Thank you, Adam. So I have a question. I think we started a bit late. How much time do we have? We're supposed to end at 4 o'clock, but so if I don't get an answer, I'll just continue for another hour because there's a lot of questions. So 20 minutes. 20 minutes? All right. Adam, actually, I'd like to. No. I'm going to go over there. You know, when you come to my age, turning your neck constantly like that is quite painful. Adam, I have a question for you. So China's dominance on the technology side, help me understand. So I'm not a metallurgist, so you need to really bring it down to an elementary school kid. Are we over-exaggerating this technology aspect of it? I mean, yes, China has much more know-how and they've been investing in it in 20, 25 years, but is it just a matter of US being able to develop it as well, but it requires innovation capital and time?
So if I understand the question, or maybe rephrase it as I understand it, what advantage does China really have? So they've taken a lot of Western technology and developed their own technology, and they've done a fantastic job of scaling it up and really reducing the cost down to, as McKinsey would say, who just left, the theoretical minimum cost. And sometimes they sell at negative cost for large periods of time. So you have Western producers who won't be able to compete in this cost or this price market. So they both have a lot of subsidy support. They can write big checks very quickly to put up processing. But on the technology, they have exactly the same technology that is on the market. They just have it cheaper CAPEX and cheaper to run. So it is difficult to compete with them, but not impossible. And there's absolutely no reason why Uzbekistan can't do that. The engineering competence is here. There's a rich engineering history here for generations. The electricity is here, the infrastructure is here, the trust is here, the rule of law is here. So they have an advantage because they're a first mover for now, but Uzbekistan is definitely an up-and-coming contender.
So in other words, there's no IP related with the technology when it comes to midstream or downstream. The technology exists, but they're just able to do it faster and cheaper.
Yeah, but also they have these furnaces, these reactors, whatever you want to call them. You can buy them in China, you can buy them in Germany, you can buy them sometimes in the US as well. and that's what we focus on, buying US, German, Polish equipment. So we do work closely with export agencies in that sense, but you'll pay more in Poland or Germany or in the US than you will in China, but it will be more reliable. And when it comes to, that's only a small amount of a small fraction of the capex of the plant. So you need to focus on reliability. You can get tech from both places, but you place more risk in taking tech from certain less trusted vendors.
Thank you. Sarah, I have a question for you, and if you're not able to answer it, I fully understand because it's related to the DFC. So how would you compare the lending mechanism of US Exim to DFC? How should Uzbekistan maneuver in searching for capital?
It's a great question, and very happy to answer it. We're obviously here on a delegation together with the DFC this week, and in my prior life, I was in an embassy setting where I spent a lot of time explaining to various private sector counterparts what the alphabet soup of the various different U.S. government agencies are. If you think about sort of the financing agencies, not just within the U.S., but in other European countries or even the East Asian countries, oftentimes you'll have one development financing agency and one export credit agency. And so very, very simplistically, that's the split. EXIM is the export credit agency. So we are there to spur U.S. job creation and the exports of U.S. goods and services. Obviously, with supply chain resiliency, we're now looking at the flow of goods the other way around as it relates to critical minerals. And that's really the core of our mandate. That being said, we fund deals directly to overseas private sector and public sector entities in both high income and low income markets. And so we have quite a broad range in terms of where we can operate and the sectors in which we can operate. We also, for the last 2 years, have had a domestic program in America called Make More in America. And so we're really looking at the supply chain end to end, where you can't necessarily move a mineral deposit. So we'll be supporting these international upstream mining transactions, but we'll also be building some midstream in the United States using our financing tools through Make More in America as well. On the DFC side, as a development finance institution, originally their funding was primarily directed towards lower income markets and job creation overseas. That being said, they've now just gone through a process to modernize some of their requirements and their mandate as well. And so, of course, they're much better suited to represent what the latest statute and mandatory requirements are from their side. But I would say that their financing has slightly less of a very clear requirement to procure from the United States like we do. That being said, in this modernization process, they have sort of increased that nexus to whether it's U.S. investors or U.S. strategic importance, which is why they're also looking at critical minerals deals. So you would see both of us, particularly if you're, say you're Uzbekistan looking at the sector. These are the two financing agencies that you'll primarily be dealing with on from the U.S. government perspective. We've got a whole suite of other tools as well, depending on the type of need for the project. So we've got other financing agencies that we also work with back in the States on the US domestic side, as well as for earlier stage project preparation and, development of grants and new technologies and things like that. Again, we've got the Department of Energy and the US Trade and Development Agency and a couple of other agencies like that that can really support based on where a company is in its life cycle.
So another question is, there has been so many game-changing pragmatism on U.S. side, Department of War investing in a publicly listed company. But my question to you is price floors. Where are we with that discussion?
Again, the benefit of our job and my job in particular is I'm a banker with a U.S. government flag over me, and so we don't necessarily influence capital P policy, and we've got other agencies like USTR that do. But certainly, as everybody in this room is aware, there's been a lot of discussions around that, and there's been a lot of negotiations in regards to coming up with some sort of price floor mechanism. My understanding is that those conversations are very much ongoing. Aside from that, as our chairman mentioned, we were just at the OECD ministerial last week, 2 weeks ago, and then at the G7 Critical Minerals Roundtable. This topic and this sector has been elevated at the OECD for the export credit financing framework. So this is a conversation that we're actively having right now as we're talking about how we lean in and become more competitive, sharpen our pencils as export credit agencies that follow OECD guidelines to finance strategic areas like this. And those, again, conversations ongoing. And then on the G7 side, certainly the conversation has been elevated to talk about, again, as mentioned, how our different countries can come together on specific transactions together. And so we're already doing this within the US government, a lot of pipeline sharing with the Department of War and with DFC, and ensuring that we're working together or deconflicting, because there's so many interesting strategic projects all over the world that we're being asked to look at. But now we're taking it a step further to say, all right, let's bring in our other ECA partners within the G7 and beyond.
Thank you. Andre, you and I have worked quite extensively in developing strategies, doing gap analysis. Your office is based in Tashkent. How could Boston Consultancy Group, with its resources, help in this journey to Uzbekistan in developing these critical raw materials?
Thank you for the question, Han. Well, you just basically answered the question yourself, right? I mean, we are based here in Tashkent. We have a large metals and mining team. Our people are trained to support our clients across their whole range of topics, including their like large capital projects. So we are here to help, and then we can be that, well, you can call it the glue, between their investors or, potential financiers and the projects or the companies, or we can be, even the part of the deal, right? I mean, we often see that actually investors, after spending some time speaking directly with our clients, come up to BCG and say, look, we are both interested, they want some finance, we want to provide finance, but there are some elements missing. Help us basically to fill up those gaps so that we could make the deal. And that exactly relates to the question of the sometimes transparency and corporate governance, like what needs to be changed, how to properly develop the recommendations, which are both acceptable for the project owners, but also, fully in compliance with the requirements of the banks and, in international, financial institutions. Sometimes it is on the level of their speaking the same language on the geological resources, understanding the numbers in the right way, and having, being basically on the same page, in terms of the plans. But what we often see, in the countries that, sometimes the project owners are so passionate and enthusiastic about, the project, is that, the targets they set for themselves, both on the process, but also in the financial results, are overly ambitious, to the extent that when, the other parties looked at outside in, they say, like, no, this is not realistic, we don't believe that someone can develop a mine, within, 3 years period of time, right? From, zero to the full production. But it's, the language that people speak here in Uzbekistan, the government sets very ambitious targets, the companies, set very ambitious targets for themselves. And of course, while doing that, it sometimes, comes a bit natural that, when you a bit of slip to the right, in your schedule plan, that's acceptable because the initial target was super ambitious. But when the international partners look into those plans outside in, I mean, that comes into the question of trust and credibility of the project owner's team. I mean, like, do you understand what kind of targets you set for yourself? Are you comfortable in delivering those targets? So we did observe, several times, like a bit of a misunderstanding in that area, and that how we can help, like our both parties, to establish the proper communication channels and like the understanding of the potential of the asset. Thank you.
Thank you. Gregory, I have a similar question for you. So I've been, in my 40-year career, I've never been involved with OECD. And in the last 3 months, I've been involved in OECD twice. We were in Paris together with First Deputy Minister and then in Istanbul. And what I've noticed is that OECD has an enormous database, knowledge that is based on that database, internal experts as well as external experts. So how could OECD help Uzbekistan in its journey in critical raw materials?
We have a wealth of standards, this is true. Well, responsible business conduct is one example. Is in the declaration on multinational enterprises is another one, and Uzbekistan aims at joining soon this declaration, which will mean that Uzbekistan commits to stick to the highest possible standard in terms of attracting foreign investors. I could speak about environmental standards, of course, as well. We have also very clear guidelines on this. But I'd like to come back to SOEs, because we have this corporate governance of SOEs guidelines that I'm sure could be applied specifically to Uzbekistan mining SOEs, and that would probably address many questions that have been raised today. So we'll be more than welcome to focusing on this going forward with Uzbekistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gregory. Mark, so I'm struggling with the concept of, the benefit that EITI brings, implementation of EITI brings to a company, a country, it is undoubtedly very clear. But perhaps the changes that needs to happen to implement that initiative is too big in a very short period of time. Is there possible ways to phase it? Have a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 within a firmly committed timeline?
Thank you, Han. When a country signs up to the EITI, it's recognized that there are different trajectories. We don't call them phases, but no country in the world, whether OECD, non-OECD, Central Asia, Africa, ever starts out by meeting a lot of the requirements in the EITI standards. So it's a journey. And that journey can take time. We often find countries go through rhythms of implementation. We have to ensure that the commitment to the EITI is bipartisan, so is sustained across governments, across electoral cycles where those apply. And some governments have legal provisions, which means they cannot necessarily immediately implement some aspects of the standard. I'll give you 2 examples. The beneficial ownership transparency is key to the latest version of the EITI standard, but many countries have privacy limitations, including in the EU, which inhibit progress on that commitment, or to the full disclosure of contracts between governments and companies. It's not going to be an overnight thing. And we would counsel against excessive speed of ambition, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but I say that because the urgency around securing access to critical raw materials is such that there can be a temptation to cut corners. And that works against the kind of provisions that we have. And that temptation can be a demand for faster permitting or doing away with requirements about putting contracts into the public domain. Those may speed things up, but over the longer term, they're bad for responsible investment and they're bad for sustainability and increased governance risks. So yes, we can approach things incrementally over time, consistent with the government's own commitments and institutions.
Okay, thank you very much. I've been warned that we have exceeded our time, so unfortunately, I don't have time for questions from the audience, but thank you for listening, and I hope we left you with some new ideas, new thoughts. It is becoming quite difficult to come up with new things going from conference to conference, but hopefully this was a bit more interactive. So thank you for listening.